We're at the Malverns Classic Festival to hunt down the raddest retro tech and discover how mountain bikes have evolved. We're looking back at products from the past which transformed mountain bike riding and paved the way for some of the great products we take for granted today. And we'll also be looking at some inventions that, although amazing, totally failed to set new trends in MTB. This is the 1995 Specialized FSR. It has 75mm of travel and was made famous by British downhiller Jason McCroy. Despite its short travel, this bike was a revolution, and the industry knew that this effective full suspension design was going to be hard to beat. FSR stands for Future Shock Rear, and it uses Horst Littner's design invented in 1985, which is known as the Horst Link or 4-bar. Because of bikes like this FSR, the Horst Link became one of the most widely used linkage designs on the market and is still used today by Specialized, and even more since the patent expired on FSR in 2014. Unfortunately, these iconic Specialized FSRs are now extremely rare, but if you want to experience what it was like to ride this amazing bike, then fear not, because Tourer Cycles have made this amazing homage to JMC's iconic bike. It still has 75mm of travel, but uses bigger wheels and is longer and slacker than the original. Let us know what you think of it in the comments. Some products, despite their iconic status, weren't destined to continue into the future. This is the Tioga disc wheel, commonly known as the Sugino tension disc or the Tioga disc drive. They were seen throughout the 90s as a pro-only piece of kit and were famously used for downhill by legend John Tomac. They were horrendously expensive, as well as super rare, so you were a big deal if you had one of these. But how do they work? Well, the wheel has no traditional steel spokes, instead replacing the 32 spokes with 256 carbon Kevlar strands, which are contained within a mylar cover which make up the discs. It was attached with a special spoke key and could use any standard low flange rear hub and most 26-inch box section rims, bolting to the hub shell and connected to the rim by nipple type things. A bit heavier than spokes, but said to offer more compliance and therefore traction in corners, as well as the aero gains you might expect from a disc rear wheel like you might see on a road time trial bike. Why didn't they catch on? Well, the design of the disc wheels was to give extra compliance in a time before effective rear suspension became commonplace. And as good as they were, rear suspension and wheel and tyre tech simply made them obsolete. Although you could certainly argue that the modern carbon rims and futuristic composite spokes of today's wheel owe a debt to composite technology which made up the Tioga disc wheels. This is a Slingshot from 1999, an amazing looking piece of kit. The Slingshot uses a wire to attach the bottom bracket shell and the bottom of the head tube, using a spring and a piece of elastomer. It was designed to give a degree of vertical compliance to the bike, making it more comfortable and boosting traction in the days before full suspension was the accepted norm. Unfortunately, the Slingshot's vertical compliance came with an unintended consequence: lateral compliance. The bike was very flexy, so it didn't ride predictably and wasn't that confidence inspiring for the rider, so unsurprisingly, the design never became mainstream. But we do love to see companies who try something different. Magura's hydraulic rim brakes were introduced in 1987 and they look really cool. They work too, so why did they die out? Well, Magura rim brakes proved very popular in trials, even until recently. They're great at predictably locking a wheel and aren't particularly expensive. They use hydraulic fluid within the hoses to press the pad horizontally onto the rim. However, you don't see many hydraulic rim brakes around these days, simply because disc brakes became so much more effective. Disc brakes work better in the mud and offer more power and modulation than rim brakes. They're also impervious to buckled wheels, which is very useful in mountain biking, which is a sport which is very hard on wheels. Some bikes like tandems and trials bikes still use Magura rim brakes, but even in these disciplines they're more or less extinct thanks to the amazing effectiveness of modern hydraulic disc brakes. As riding speeds kept increasing throughout the 1980s, brake technology had a hard time keeping up, and rim brakes were the standard. But by the early 90s, mechanical disc brakes had been invented, and they were popular for extreme riding due to their increased power and improved wet weather performance. These are Zinn brakes, and they're cable actuated. They're from 1992. They use a one-piece caliper, which is pretty forward thinking, and that leads to extra stiffness, and then only one of the pistons moves and the back one is static. Don't they look cool? This is a Sensible Products DCD, or Dave's Chain device, a rubber roller that limits how far the untensioned lower part of the chain can travel from side to side on its way back to the chainring. It was moderately effective and importantly could work with a double or triple chainring setup, which is what most bikes had back in the day. But unfortunately, it would only work with skinny round chainstays like these. Although it did help with the problem of drop chains, it certainly didn't eliminate them altogether. Now this is a cool invention. Back when front suspension was expensive, one way to gain some comfort and compliance on the front of your bike was a Flexstem. It used a piece of elastomer between the stem and the steerer tube to offer some movement between your hands and the bike. This was as sketchy as it sounds, with some flex and the bars moving weirdly, which could take riders some serious time to get used to. This strange in-betweener tech died out for mountain biking, and now we have excellent suspension forks instead, which do the same job but much more effectively. However, if you're a gravel rider, there are modern equivalents. Capitalizing on the trail-beating buzz capabilities of a Flexstem without the weight of a suspension fork are the Cane Creek E-Silk stem and the Redshift shock stop. Head to the BikeRadar website to learn more about them. The flex from a Flexstem and many rudimentary suspension systems comes from something called elastomer. This is a foam rubber with air trapped in the pockets providing the spring and rubber providing some of the damping, so it wasn't just a pogo stick. It was cheap compared to an air or coil spring suspension device, but it did degrade over time, and they also stiffened up in cold weather, and they didn't really provide much damping. But thankfully, this 1990s wonder material has died out, and now manufacturers use high-tech air and coil springs instead. There has been a great surge in the popularity of high pivot rear suspension systems recently, with brands like Forbidden, Norco and Trek all using this system on their new flagship bikes. However, high pivot suspension systems aren't anything new, as we can see by this iconic GT RTS. They look really different and offer the advantage of a rearward axle path. This helps keep the bike stable and additionally helps stop the bike hanging up on square-edged hits. However, crucially, many old school high pivot bikes, like this one, are missing one ingredient, an idler wheel. Idlers help manage the way the rear suspension responds to pedaling input, and without these, bikes like this would have been difficult to tame, so props to the riders who rode them. If you want to continue your deep dive into the progression of mountain bike tech, check out this video next.